So today I wanted to do a pretty short and simple video on how you can pretty easily and consistently get a specific mythic item that will allow you to salvage it to then get a lot of resplendent sparks that you can then use to craft other mythics you may need. Now there's a few caveats with this. While this is pretty consistent, you do need to do a bit of farming for this, even though I think this is still the fastest way to just get a purple item to salvage for the resplendent sparks. But while this is pretty easy to get those resplendent sparks, no matter what type of mythic crafting you're doing, you can only wear one crafted mythic. So whether you're using the seasonal mythic crafting of upgrading to a mythic using the new seasonal currency, or whether you're crafting the random iconic mythics from the blacksmith, or whether you're crafting the more randomized mythic items from the jeweler, any crafted mythic from any of those methods will always have the crafted tag, meaning you can only wear one of those at a time. Now I think the real boon of doing this farm is if you're a class or a build that needs an iconic mythic, or maybe even needs multiple iconic mythics, to where you could pretty easily do this to constantly roll new iconic mythics. Even though you can only wear one of those at a time, iconic mythics are by far the most rare items in the game right now, so being able to at least get one fairly easily is going to be a pretty big upgrade for your build if you currently have none. And this is probably going to be much more simple than you think, and someone on Reddit figured this out, that if you go to the gambler, so you go and use your opals on a gambler, and you just gamble for pole arms, for whatever reason, you have a pretty good chance to get the Shattered Vow mythic pole arm, which I don't think is really used in any build, but again, we're primarily farming this to salvage them for resplendent sparks to use on crafting other mythics. And this person on the Reddit post says they think it's around 5%. I don't really know if it's around that, but I will say on average, I'm getting 1 to 2 of these per cap of opals, which is 25,000 opals, which may sound like a lot, but you could actually get quite a bit that we'll also go over. So essentially every time you cap out your opals and you go roll at the vendor, you'll probably get like 1 or 1.5 of these Shattered Vows. Sometimes you'll get 2, sometimes you could maybe even get more. Sometimes if you're pretty unlucky, you'll get 0 for that 25,000 section. But through one Escalation Nightmare Sigil, if you get all 3 of the dungeon runs with opals on it, you will generally be getting 20 to 25,000 opals just from that one escalation dungeon. So opals are actually really fast to farm, so you will be able to get quite a lot of these Shattered Vows pretty quickly. Now that's legitimately the entirety of this farm. You just go get opals and you go spend them at the gambler, spend it on pole arms, and for whatever reason, Shattered Vows just have a much higher chance to drop than any other mythics from the gambling vendor, and you can get them pretty consistently to salvage for resplendent sparks. Now, how do you actually go about farming opals? And it's actually quite easy, and realistically, you only need 3 points in your Nightmare Dungeon skill tree to most effectively farm opals. And you're just going to take all of the nodes down the middle section of the Nightmare Dungeon skill tree. First is Dread Revival. Bosses in Nightmare Dungeons have a chance to respawn when slain. Now this node is actually much more important than you think, and that's because of how some of the Nightmare Dungeon affixes work. Specifically, any of the Nightmare Dungeon affixes that are reserve, or specifically things that you go open up a chest and it gives you the loot. So gold reserve, opals reserve, any of the gem fragment reserves, any of those, when you kill a boss in a Nightmare Dungeon, they drop a large chunk of whatever drops from those chests. So if you're doing an opal reserve run in a Nightmare Dungeon, then you kill the boss will drop a large chunk of opals. It'll usually be the amount of loot of like 3+ chests within that specific run. So let's say you're on the 3rd dungeon of an Escalation Sigil and you're doing an opal run. When you kill the boss at the end, the boss could give you legitimately thousands of opals just from that boss kill, and those bosses being able to respawn through this node is very good. Also, on top of this, any of the naturally spawning bosses in the Nightmare Dungeons are still considered bosses. So butchers, X-Vows, that weird bug that you find in Helltides, any of those are considered bosses. So when you kill those and you're doing an opal run, they will also drop a bunch of opals, and they can also respawn with this node. So you could get a butcher to spawn in, you kill him, he could respawn, and then you kill him again, and both of those butchers will drop a large chunk of opals if you're doing an opal reserve run. So very good first node. The second node, bosses have +1 monster power, and they have a chance to drop Escalation Sigils. sigils. This will just allow you to much more easily always have escalation sigils to run, because you should always be doing escalation sigils for nightmare dungeons. Running the base sigils aren't really worth it, because even the first tier of an escalation sigil, so the first dungeon, will give more out of the affixes than normal. So if you run a normal nightmare sigil with the opals affix on it, and then you compare that to the first dungeon of an escalation sigil with the opals reserve on it, the escalation sigil dungeon will actually give you a lot more opals out of it, and each subsequent dungeon in that escalation sigil will give more for each affix. So if you say run an escalation sigil and all 3 of your dungeons you get the opals reserve affix on it, tier 1 will drop the least amount, tier 2 will drop more, and the tier 3 dungeon will drop even more. That also includes what the bosses at the end drop. And if you do an escalation sigil and have all 3 of them with opals reserve, you will almost always get at least 20,000 opals. You can get even more, because again, if the butcher spawns or if the bosses revive from the first node, you could get even more. So you can legitimately do an escalation sigil, get the opals reserve affix on all 3 of the dungeons, and you can cap out your opals just through that, which is very, very fast. Now, the final node will help you actually do that. That's branching pathways. When advancing to the next dungeon in a nightmare escalation, 2 additional heraldic portals spawn. So that thing that spawns in at the end of a dungeon in an escalation sigil that you click on that ports you to the next dungeon, now 3 of those will spawn, which will just give you more options on choosing the affixes you want for the next dungeon. So this means you have a very low chance to not have an option that has the opal affix on it. You will almost always have an option to get more opals throughout a run, and since you're getting more and more loot as you go through those dungeons, getting like a tier 3 opal gives a lot more than, let's say, a tier 1. And that's legitimately the entirety of the farm. It's pretty simple. Just go take those nodes in your nightmare dungeon tree, just spam run escalation sigils, always choosing opals whenever you get the option, and then once you fill up on opals, go gamble for pole arms, and you'll start to pretty consistently get the Shattered Vow Mythic, which then you salvage to get more resplendent sparks that then you can go craft mythics on, specifically being really good if you need iconic mythics, so you can at least get your 1 iconic mythic. And even when you do get that iconic mythic you need, you could keep doing this to keep crafting new iconic mythics to try to get much better rolls on those. And again, you'll be able to pretty consistently get these to do that. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.